vivid versions.
Let me tell you about the 6 weeks I will never get back. And before I get to the part that made me sit on the floor of my kitchen at 2 in the morning staring at a glass of water I'd forgotten to drink, I want to tell you how we got there. Because it didn't start with a lie. It started with something smaller. It started with the way she used to go quiet whenever I talked about the fellowship. I'd been working toward the Hargrove residency for 2 years. 2 years of applications, deferred plans, a portfolio that I rebuilt from scratch after the first submission didn't make the cut. When it finally came through, a 14-month placement overseas with a research team I'd followed since grad school. I told her over dinner. She smiled. She said she was proud of me. And then she changed the subject, and I noticed that, but I let it go. That was the first moment. There were others. A comment about couples who do long distance and how she doesn't believe it ever really works. A joke, or she framed as a joke, about how she'd probably just cease to exist without me around. Small things, soft things, the kind of thing that sounds like love until you have to decide what it costs. I told myself she'd come around. I told myself she was processing. I started looking at flights, started talking to the team lead about housing, started imagining the life. And then, about 3 weeks before my departure date, she sat me down at the kitchen table with a look I hadn't seen before, and she said, "I just need you here. You're the only one who makes me feel safe when things are this bad." And then she told me she'd been to see her doctor, that there was something on the scan, that they were still running tests, but that the word they'd used, and she said this word carefully, like it cost her something, was concerning. She said she didn't want to make it about her. She said she didn't want to ask me to stay. And then she cried, and I held her, and I thought, there's no version of me that gets on that plane. I called the residency coordinator the next morning. I withdrew. I thanked them for the opportunity, and I used the phrase personal circumstances, and I didn't elaborate. The team lead, a woman named Dr. Reeves, whom I'd exchanged probably 40 emails with, wrote back and said she was sorry, and that they'd keep my file, and that she hoped everything was okay. I appreciated that. I put my bag back in the closet, and I stayed. I want to be precise about what staying looked like because I think that matters. I drove her to every appointment. Not some, every. There were 7 over the following 5 weeks, and I was at all of them, sitting in those beige waiting rooms with the too cold air conditioning, reading nothing, just being there. I cooked. I didn't complain when she couldn't sleep and neither of us slept. I called her mother, a conversation that cost me something, if I'm honest, because her mother has never particularly liked me, but I called because I thought she deserved to know. I canceled the consulting contract worth about $11,000 because the timeline overlapped with what she'd told me might be the hard stretch. I didn't mention the $11,000. I didn't keep score. That wasn't the relationship I thought I was in. The friend in the medical field, his name is Garrett. We've known each other since undergrad, and he works in hospital administration. He didn't call me to expose anything. He called me because he was in the area and wanted to get lunch. And we were sitting at this counter at a sandwich place, and I was telling him, in that way you do, that things have been hard, that she'd been dealing with some health stuff. And he asked what kind. And I told him what I knew, which I realized as I was saying it out loud, was very little. She'd been vague about the specifics. Protective, I'd thought. Private. Garrett got a look on his face that I would describe as careful. He asked the name of her doctor. I told him. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're thinking about 3 things at once. He said, "I know that practice." A pause. They're a general practitioner. They don't do that kind of scan. Another pause. And then he said, very quietly, "Has she shown you anything? Any paperwork?" "She hasn't." I said no. She said she was handling it herself. Garrett looked at his sandwich. He said, "I'm not trying to start anything." And I said, "I know." And we talked about something else for the rest of lunch. But I already knew. I think somewhere I'd known for a while and had just been filing it in the drawer labeled "Don't Go Here." Because once you open that drawer, you can't close it. I sat with it for 3 days. I want you to understand what those 3 days were like, because they weren't what you'd expect. I wasn't furious. I was something colder and quieter than furious. I went to work. I made dinner. I watched her across the table, and I thought about all the things I'd handed over and how none of them had been given back. I thought about Dr. Reeves's email. I thought about the $11,000. I thought about her mother's voice on the phone, cracking slightly, saying, "Is it serious?" And me saying, "We don't know yet, but we're taking it one day at a time." I thought about what it means to lie to someone who loves you and whether the person doing it understands the full weight of what they're holding. I decided she does. You don't construct something like that without knowing. 3 days. That's all you get. Here is what I did before I said a single word to her. I went back through my calendar. I am, by nature, someone who documents things, not obsessively, just as a habit, the same way some people keep receipts. I had the dates of every appointment I'd attended. I had the emails from the residency coordinator. I had the declined contract in my sent folder with the explanation I'd given. Personal circumstances relating to a family health situation. I had a text thread where she'd referenced the diagnosis and what they found no fewer than 8 times over the preceding 6 weeks. I pulled all of it. I didn't need it as ammunition. I needed it because I was a fair witness to my own experience, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't misremembering anything in a way that wasn't fair to her. I wasn't misremembering. She used the word diagnosis. She used it on February the 4th, the 9th, the 17th, and twice on the 22nd. That's not a slip. That's architecture. The consulting contract, $11,200, declined on January 31st. The 7 appointments, most of which I now understood had been for what? I didn't know yet. General check-ins. Maybe. Routine things she'd reframed. The Hargrove residency. The letter of withdrawal was time-stamped January 28th at 9:43 in the morning, about 14 hours after the kitchen table conversation. 14 hours. I'd barely slept between the telling and the sending. I thought about the early signs. The way she'd gone quiet at dinner when I first told her about the fellowship. The comments about long distance. The joke about ceasing to exist. I hadn't wanted to read those as controlling. I'd read them as anxious, and maybe they were both. But anxiety doesn't explain the construction of a medical narrative specific enough to contain doctors' names and scan results and a word like concerning. That is not anxiety. That is decision-making. She made a decision. She made it for me, without telling me she was making it. I'd thought about whether there was another explanation. I'd given it 3 full days, which is more than most people give things like this. I kept turning it over. Maybe she'd misunderstood something a doctor said. Maybe she'd catastrophized a minor finding into something worse. But I'd asked her twice, gently, whether she wanted me to come in with her for the next appointment, and both times she'd said she'd prefer to handle it alone. And the appointments had kept happening, and the results had kept being vague, and every time I got close to the specifics, she found a way to stay general. That's not misunderstanding. That's management. She needed you afraid and close. That was the whole thing. I decided on a Tuesday I was going to say one thing, and it was going to be the truest thing I'd said in 6 weeks, and I wasn't going to raise my voice, and I wasn't going to make it into more than it was. I packed my bag that afternoon while she was out. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being practical. I knew that once I said it, there was nothing left to say after, and I didn't want there to be a version of this where I was still standing in her apartment 40 minutes later while she cried and I tried to figure out what to do with my hands. Once. You say it once. Then you're done. She came home around 6. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd told me about the doctor, the scans, the word concerning. I had my hands flat on the table. I wasn't performing calm. I was calm. That's a different thing. She could tell something was off. She asked if I was okay. I said yes. She sat down. I said, I know. She went still. And in that stillness, I saw everything I needed to see. She's not confused. She knows exactly what I mean. File that. She asked what I meant. I told her. Garrett's name. The practice. The skin they don't do. The word she'd used 8 times that had no paperwork behind it. I said it all once, evenly, the way you'd read a list of items at a post office. No heat. No accusation in my tone. Just the facts, which were accusation enough without any decoration. She started to talk, and I let her talk. I want to be clear. I let her say everything she wanted to say. She said she'd been scared. She said she thought I was going to leave, and she didn't know how to stop it. She said she hadn't thought it would go on this long. She said she knew it was wrong, and I believe that she knew, but I also believe that she'd known at the time and had done it anyway, and that distinction matters more than people give it credit for. When she stopped, I said, I would have stayed for the real you. You didn't give me that chance. There it is. That's the whole thing. She started crying. I understood why, but I'd already done the crying quietly alone over 3 days in the form of sitting very still and thinking very hard about what this meant and what I was worth and what I was willing to carry. I stood up. I got my bag from the bedroom, and I left. The next one to call was her friend Becca. Becca is warm and earnest and has known her for about 12 years. And she reached me on a Wednesday evening while I was at my desk trying to figure out if the Hargrove residency still had any pathway back, which, as it turned out, they did partially in a reduced capacity, but that came later. Becca said, she's devastated. I think you owe her a conversation. I'll let her finish. I'll let her say the whole thing because she deserved that, and because I genuinely like Becca, and because what she was doing came from care rather than strategy. She only has one side of this. Give her one question. I said, did she tell you what she told me 6 weeks ago? At the kitchen table. Silence. Did she tell you what she said about the scan? More silence. And then, she said she thought she might be sick. I said, did she tell you that she wasn't? That there was never a diagnosis? That she told me there was in order to keep me from taking the residency? A long pause. I heard her exhale. She said, she didn't. She said she'd panicked. I said, I understand. I appreciate you calling. I thanked her. I ended the call. That's how it goes. Every single time. Her brother called on Thursday. He's a steady, practical man named Theo, and I'd always liked him. And he called with the same energy. Not aggressive, just loyal. He said he thought I was making a mistake, that she was going through something hard and the last thing she needed was to be abandoned. I let him finish. Abandoned. Interesting word. Let him hear the question. I said, did she tell you about the Hargrove residency? He said yes. He knew I'd had to give up an opportunity. I said, did she tell you why she told me I had to? Pause. She said you wanted to stay. I said, Theo, I wanted to ask her, not me, just ask her whether there was ever an actual medical finding. A real one with documentation. Just ask her that one question. I thanked him. I ended the call. I kid you not. His call came at 7:14 p.m. Her colleague from the architecture firm, a woman named Rose, called at 7:43. 29 minutes. I don't know what they were doing in between, but the pattern had started and it was going to run itself out. Rose was less gentle than the others. Rose said she thought I'd been selfish and that I didn't understand the kind of anxiety her friend dealt with, and that some people needed different things than other people could give. And she said all of this in a tone that suggested she had rehearsed it. I let her finish. She believes this completely. She hasn't heard the other part. One question. I said, did she tell you that she told me she had been diagnosed with something serious? Not that she was anxious, that she had a diagnosis. Rose stopped. Did she tell you that I withdrew from a 14-month fellowship on the basis of that? That I turned down work and sat in waiting rooms for 6 weeks for something that was never there? A long pause. I said, I'm not asking you to take side. I'm asking whether she told you that specific thing. Rose said, she said you'd found out she'd exaggerated. Exaggerated. That's the word she used with them. I said, I think the difference between exaggerating and telling me I needed to stay because of a diagnosis matters. That's all. I thanked her. I ended the call. The calls kept coming for 2 days. Her friend from the old job. A woman from her book club I'd only met twice. Her cousin, who was kind and clearly uncomfortable and who I think had been pushed to call rather than volunteering for it. Each time, let them finish. One question. Wait. Thank them. End the call. You don't need to win this. You need them to ask the right question. And then, and this is the part one didn't expect, honestly, her best friend called. Not Becca, the other one, Simone. They'd known each other since they were 17, grew up together, the kind of friendship where the other person knows every version of you you've ever been. I'd always figured if there was anyone who was going to hold the line for her no matter what, it was Simone. Simone called on Friday morning. She said, I've been thinking about what to say for 2 days. I said, take your time. She said, I know what she did. She told me, not the version she told everyone else. The real version. She told me right after it happened, back in January. A pause. I told her not to. I told her it would go exactly like this. Another pause. I'm not calling to take your side. I'm calling because she's not telling people the full story, and I don't think that's fair to you. Don't let this land on your face. Register it. File it. I said, I appreciate you telling me that. Simone said, I'm sorry you lost the fellowship. And then, I hope you find a way back in. I thanked her. I ended the call, and I sat there for a moment in the quiet of my apartment, and I thought, it only takes one. That's the thing about constructed versions of events. They require unanimous maintenance. The second one person in the room knows the real story, the whole structure develops a crack. And cracks don't stop. 2 hours later, she called me directly, not through anyone else. Her voice was different from the night at the kitchen table. It wasn't crying, it wasn't performing. It was something tighter and more desperate, which I think was the sound of someone realizing that the story they'd told wasn't holding the way they needed it to. She said I was being cruel. She said I was making her look like a bad person to everyone who knew her. She said that wasn't who she was, and that I knew it wasn't who she was, and that what she did came from love, even if it came out wrong. I let her say all of it. She wants you to argue. Arguing means she's not done. Don't argue. She said, I just need you here back in January. Same energy, different tactic. I said, I've heard you. She said, that's all you're going to say? I said, yes. She hung up. I know how that sounds, but there was nothing else to say. Here is what happened over the following 2.5 weeks. She called Dr. Reeves. I don't fully know how that conversation went because I wasn't there for it and she told me about it secondhand. But from what I understand, she reached out to the residency programs coordination office and explained, honestly, apparently, that she had misinformed her partner about a medical situation and that it had resulted in his withdrawal, and she asked whether there was anything she could do to support a reentry. I don't know what she expected that to accomplish. I don't know if she expected anything, but she did it. Theo called me and told me she'd done it. He said it quietly, like he was still processing it. He said, she told me everything. I said, I know. He said, she asked me to tell you. I said, okay. She sent an email to the consulting firm I'd withdrawn the contract from. She explained, again, apparently honestly, that the reason I'd declined the work was because of information she'd given me that was not accurate. She asked if the contract was still available. It wasn't, but the project manager later told me the email had been sent, which is the kind of thing that lands differently when you're not expecting it. She produced the doctor's records, not because I asked for them. She printed out 6 weeks of appointment summaries, routine visits, one follow-up on a minor blood panel, nothing close to what she described, and she put them in an envelope and left them with Becca to give to me. I don't know why she needed me to have them. I think she needed me to see the shape of the actual thing versus the shape of what she'd built held side by side. She started seeing someone, a therapist specifically, not couples, just individual. Simone confirmed it, unsolicited, when we crossed paths 2 weeks later. She said, "She's doing the work." I said, "Good," and I meant it. I meant it completely, and that's not a performance of generosity. I genuinely wanted her to figure out whatever it was that had made January feel like the only option. She apologized to her mother, who had been told about the health situation by me. I found out about that from her mother directly, who called me once, briefly, to say, "She told me the truth. I don't know what you need from me, but I wanted you to know." I said, "Thank you. You didn't have to call." She said, "She asked me to." 5 things she gave back. 5 things she took on. You weren't keeping score, but there it is anyway. And then she called me, not to ask for anything, not to argue, not to send a message through someone else. She called and she said, "You were right that I did it on purpose." I've been trying to find a way to say it wasn't, but it was. I knew what I was doing. I want you to know that I know that. I said, "I appreciate you saying it." She said, "I just need you to know I heard you." She said it. She said, "I just need you." The same 4 words, different meaning. I said, "I heard you too." There was a pause. Then she said, "How fast does someone have to change before you believe it's real?" I thought about that. I said, "I don't know that speed is the thing I'm measuring." And that was it. That was the whole conversation. Becca told me, later, that she thought the change had been almost unsettling in its speed, that she'd never seen her move through something so completely in such a short time. I told Becca what I believe, which is that the timeline doesn't tell you much. 2 weeks of doing the right thing in a row doesn't prove anything, but it doesn't disprove anything either. What you look for is whether the direction has changed. That's the only question. Not how fast, not how complete. Just, is the direction different now? I don't know the answer to that yet. I don't think I'm meant to know yet. I emailed Dr. Reeves on a Thursday morning. I explained the situation without going into specifics and asked whether there was any version of a reentry into the program, even a modified one, that might still be on the table. She replied within the day. She said there was a short-term consulting engagement attached to the same team. 4 months, reduced scope, that was still unfilled, and that if I was interested, she'd be glad to talk. I am interested. I told her so. Here's what I think about all of it, now that I've set it down somewhere outside my own head. She didn't lie because she didn't love me. I want to be clear about that. I think she lied exactly because she did, and that's almost a harder thing to sit with. But love that doesn't trust you with itself, love that decides you can't handle the real version of its fear, that you need to be managed rather than met. That's not love doing its best work. That's love that hasn't learned yet that the person across the table would have stayed for the actual truth. I would have stayed. I would have had the hard conversation about distance and doubt and what we both needed, and maybe we'd have found something workable, or maybe we wouldn't, but at least it would have been real. She didn't give either of us that chance. And that's the thing you can't reverse with receipts and phone calls and therapy appointments. Not because the receipts don't matter, but because you can't give someone back the version of themselves that trusted you before they had a reason not to. You only get to be the one who told the truth from the start once. After that, the truth is just what you're doing now that you've been caught. She said, "I just need you here." And I needed her to trust me enough to need me honestly. That's the whole distance between us in one sentence. I hope she closes it with someone someday. I just don't think that someone is me anymore.
Thanks for listening.